How do leadership and resources relate to technology and innovation? I'm Dr. Nick Sambaluk, and that is the question in this unit of the 2015 Technology, Innovation, and the Civil War course. It was Britain that first saw the invention of the steam locomotive. But as a sprawling country rich with natural resources and a growing and productive population, the United States responded enthusiastically to the early railroads. In fact, investment mushroomed during the 1840s, and although there was a slump in the following decade, the United States had more railroads in 1860 than any other country on Earth. As we mentioned in the introduction unit, the Confederacy ranked third behind Britain and then the Union portion of the United States. James J. Andrews, a Kentuckian who was loyal to the United States, wanted to do something about that Confederate amount of railroad mileage. With federal approval, he recruited one other civilian and 21 enlisted Ohio infantry who had volunteered for a special mission. The plan was to hijack a locomotive between Atlanta and the Confederate rail hub of Chattanooga, using the train to traverse parts of Confederate Georgia and Tennessee, stopping the train to restock the train's supply of fuel, which was wood, and to cut the telegraph wires and damage track and bridges and the track switches that make it possible to route a locomotive on one or another of two diverging rails. Track switches are important because they are what allows a train to turn, although obviously only at specific points where rail lines exist. By cutting communications and impeding transportation, Andrews and the federal government hoped to make the Confederacy's position in the West less tenable. In a sense, a map of the Confederacy looks something like the inside span of a crescent. That means that hostile territory, in a limited sense, threatens to surround the country. This is known as central position. During the 19th century, central position was often viewed from a historical vantage point as an advantage for the defender. After all, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Frederick II, had resisted three much larger military powers in France, Austria, and Russia in the 18th century by using his central position and their uncoordinated assaults to smash his armies against would-be attackers and then move his army to a new front to repeat the process, thus staving off invasion against Prussia. Napoleon, on the operational level of war, liked using central position to do a similar thing on successive battlefields during a campaign. It allowed for defeating an enemy in pieces. This is known in military terminology as defeat in detail. Two factors are key to the historical advantage of central position. First, bold commanders move their forces to and fro in a deliberate way. They move them with purpose, faster than their enemies move them. Second, for both sides, land transportation is theoretically on a similar footing, literally. The troops were marching on foot. This is something that is a commonality in the era in which we see central position being sometimes made into a spectacular advantage. Frederick the Great and Napoleon both preceded the railroads. So the railroads, or their existence, or their condition, could make a big difference in determining whether central position was really such a good thing in the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s. On April 12, 1862, Andrews and his band, which had covertly snuck into the Confederacy, stole the locomotive called the General when it was on a routine stop, and they began their trek. Bystanders notified Confederate train conductor William Fuller that his locomotive had been stolen, and he began running after the train on foot. Trains were then quite light machines relative to today. They were running on iron rails, which were fragile relative to steel, and they burned wood as a fuel, which is less efficient than coal and certainly less efficient than diesel, which are more modern train fuels. So there are many factors about trains that are different from what we might assume, given a 20th or 21st century conception of what a train might look like. In fact, the General couldn't make more than about 15 miles an hour under normal circumstances, so it wasn't absolutely impossible to think about chasing after a train on foot or on horseback. Complicating this situation for the Union team, Andrews had selected volunteers for the secret mission, but that secrecy had prevented him from specifying that familiarity with running a light locomotive might be useful for the mission. Also, the Union crew had to stop the train and refuel it. The wood runs out. They had to keep on the train's regular schedule at the same time to prevent the locals from getting suspicious about why is there a different group of people running the train at the wrong time. They also had to make additional stops, of course, to damage Confederate infrastructure. That, of course, was something that the General was not scheduled to ordinarily do. So it would be really helpful if the train crew was able to operate faster and more efficiently than a team that was actually trained to. Of course, this is exactly what Andrews doesn't have. Fuller, the Confederate train conductor, commandeered a hand-powered rail cart, and eventually the powerful locomotive Texas, which had been making a southbound trip on the same rail down the line. Now the drive on the Texas was reversed, and it traveled back northward, with a contingent of Confederate soldiers on board, ready to attack and capture Andrews' band. After several hours, Andrews' men realized that they could not effectively run the train fast enough to evade determined pursuit along the tracks. So Andrews' men scattered and fled, but all of them were captured. And of the 20 raiders who actually boarded the train, 6 escaped their captors later on, and 6 others were exchanged for Confederate prisoners later on in the war, and 8 were hanged as spies. Private Jacob Parrott was not yet 19 when he took part in the mission. After capture and during torture, he refused to divulge information. After being exchanged, he became the first person ever awarded the new Medal of Honor, a military decoration for bravery and accomplishment. The Medal of Honor's Civil War history is a convoluted one. It's now awarded only in rare circumstances, but during the Civil War, it was essentially the only medal that ordinary soldiers could receive for notable service. In fact, it was, at first, impossible for an officer to win the award. Since it was the only medal for enlisted personnel's accomplishment or bravery, the Union distributed 2,625 of them during the war. This was so many, and for such an array of reasons, that Congress investigated in late 1916, half a century after the war has ended, and it rescinded 911 of them. On one issue, the military was insistent. The Medal of Honor went to members of the armed forces. Although James Andrews had been engaged with government knowledge and approval in an act of war on behalf of the United States, and had been executed by the Confederacy as an illegal combatant because of his civilian status, the U.S. Army also spurned the idea of awarding Andrews with a posthumous decoration. The Union's balloonists, and its telegraph operators as well, were typically civilians working on contract alongside the Union Army. Their civilian status meant that they might easily be executed as spies if they were captured. Although this caused some friction complicating the effective use of balloons and telegraphs in the war, the Union did little to solve the problem. One might say that the civilian status issue was an area in which the United States missed an opportunity to innovate. Beginning to address this issue was something that was going to have to wait for another century, and I hope to be able to teach a course including that subject soon. Major Joe Scott's article on U.S. military ballooning gives a valuable picture of the use and the practicality of balloons for reconnaissance. The United States' first flirtation with a balloon force ended after the Battle of Chancellorsville with a total force of 9 balloons. The Confederacy briefly attempted to answer in kind, but a shortage of the right resources hindered their efforts. The Ironclad is an iconic technology of the Civil War, but as we'll see in our course readings, its role and its impact were somewhat mixed. The Confederacy attached iron bars to the side of a salvaged ex-Union warship hull and christened the vessel Virginia, and the battle between it and the new Union ironclad Monitor occurred in March 1862, less than 5 weeks before Andrew's attack on the Confederacy's Western and Atlantic Railroad line. Although a standoff, the Monitor ended the Confederacy's hope of sinking the Union's numerous wooden ships, which were making the blockade of several Confederate ports increasingly effective and therefore making it increasingly difficult to import weapons, ammunition, and materials the Confederacy needed to keep going. Furthermore, the Monitor was able to fight the larger Virginia to a draw because the Monitor had a pair of 11-inch cannon in a rotating turret that equaled the performance of Virginia's 12 cannon, which were relatively fixed. The shallow draft Monitor was entirely built of iron, unlike the ironclad Virginia, which had coverings above water that were iron. Monitor was, in fact, a far bolder innovation than Virginia was, and the U.S. Navy Secretary Gideon Welles hoped that ironclads would be a mass-produced weapons system to attack Confederate defended coastal cities. William Roberts' book will add more detail in this area. One criticism of ironclads was that the materials that they required meant that iron was not appearing in the form of iron cannon, or iron locomotives, or iron rails. The use of scarce materials is a trade-off. In war and in peace, strategy, remember, is about using national resources effectively to promote a country's objectives by using the tools that are available. No matter what strategic decisions are made, there will be drawbacks and there will be critics. The concepts of innovation point in many directions. So, we're left with the question that we asked at the start of the unit. How do leadership and resources relate to technology and innovation? Next time, the Army Cyber Institute law expert Bob Clark will introduce us to some of the legal and policy innovations of the Civil War. Thanks.